Hi, class. We are here to finish our adaptations to training lecture. We have 6 slides that we're going to look at overtraining, detraining, and retraining. So I'll go ahead and share my slide and we can get started. Okay, so first is this term overreaching. Overreaching is overtraining, but on the short-term basis. And it's this excessive training, this high amount of volume, high amount of intensity that accumulates within a few weeks. So think of being exposed to a training workload, but this training workload persists for several days. We're going to accumulate acute fatigue. Well, let's say that acute fatigue lasts for several more days, up to a week or a few weeks. That's what we call functional overreaching. But the key term here is functional, meaning we don't see decrements in performance. We don't see increase in sickness or adverse health effects. We see high levels of work with some fatigue there. And so let's discuss how this phase of overtraining can actually be a planned phase in our training programs. So to understand that, we want to look at this graph down here at the bottom. What this graph shows is on the y-axis, we see high levels of fitness down to low levels of fitness. On the x-axis, we see workload. We see low workloads, so low intensities, very minimal type work, and then we see all the way up to high workloads. We see our fitness level starts to increase as we increase the workload up until we are training at a moderate workload. But we're training at this workload for days to weeks. So we're in this overreaching phase. So to understand how it's a planned phase in a training program, I want you to think about two-a-days that occur during the off season before the actual preseason or in season starts. So think best example is football, I know, which does a lot of two-a-day type workouts in the morning, workouts in the afternoon. And with these two-a-day workouts, these athletes accumulate a lot of mental fatigue, physical fatigue, neural fatigue, all of that. And so that's the prime example of overreaching. What's the purpose of two-a-days? What's the purpose of pushing our athletes this hard? We're building a base of fitness. So we're trying to establish a base of fitness where we can build on top of that later. So if we have a base of fitness, it means we have improved endurance capacity. So cardiorespiratory endurance, aerobic fitness has improved. We have improved just like muscle strength, but not high levels of strength, not explosive power or anything like that. We're just like at this base. And we can build on this base throughout the rest of the season. And so once preseason gets here, we can increase our workloads to where we are improving strength, improving power outcomes. And then in season, we can maintain everything that we have accumulated thus far. And so with functional overreaching, it's planned phase in a lot of programs. We're just building this base of fitness. The key here to prevent overtraining is to add rest after we've accumulated this fitness. Once we rest for the weekend, or we rest for a few weeks before our preseason starts, that's where we can prevent any adverse side effects that would lead us into overtraining. And so that's why functional overreaching can be very beneficial for athletes, short-term basis of high intensity training, building this base, and we've got our athletes this solid foundation in which they can build on top of later. But we're giving them rest, and so they recover, and that recovery prevents going into this next phase right here. So our next phase is functional overreaching. So this would be long-term overreaching that causes performance decreases or decrements due to lack of recovery. So this is when you go through kind of everything I just said about overreaching, but you don't give that rest break. You don't give the weekend to recover. You don't give the few weeks before preseason or in season starts in order to kind of reverse any negative effects that have occurred. And so with this occurs within weeks to months of exposure to moderate to very high workloads. And so now over here, we are in this purple zone, but we're just at the top of this purple zone. We just kind of passed overreaching, and now our fitness may actually start to decline here. So fitness levels start to decline because we aren't giving ourselves recovery. And so when you think of recovery, think of either like decreased frequency of training, think of decreased intensity of training, just decreased exposure to whatever workload you've been experiencing. The last one is actual overtraining syndrome. So this overtraining syndrome, collection of symptoms or behaviors occur when an athlete, again, has inadequate recovery. Research on overtraining syndrome, researchers say that it actually takes a huge training stimulus over months and months and months of training to elicit this syndrome. It's way more common to experience this functional overreaching, which does have symptoms, and you will experience kind of different feelings of fatigue and this accumulation of stress on your body. But to actually hit overtraining syndrome, it takes a huge workload over, like I said, months to years to experience. But we're going to look at some symptoms of this, and we're going to look at the progression of how this actually works on the next slides. So first, let's talk about those symptoms of fatigue that we would experience. Or sorry, symptoms of overtraining. So this is anaerobic training only. There is a whole other collection of symptoms and behaviors for aerobic overtraining. This is just anaerobic, okay? Obviously, we're going to see increased fatigue. We have muscle soreness, we have depleted energy stores, we just can't perform at the level that we have been previously. We have decreased glycolytic capacity. Glycolysis has slowed. Glycolysis is not functioning correctly, which will decrease our force production. Our motor control is altered. And so this has to do with the force production with, again, adequate energy, but also actin and myosin being able to bind together. So this is inhibited. We see loss of appetite. So even though your body is probably craving fuel at this point to repair your damaged tissue, you don't have an appetite to actually eat. You have altered mood, which the mood alterations is actually one of the first things to symptoms to be produced. With altered mood, you see irritability. We see apathy for whatever you were doing at the time. We see just like anger issues occur, sleep disturbances, so unable to sleep, even though, again, your body is craving it. Altered immune function, which means your body is going to get sick more, and then increased resting blood pressure and heart rate. So rested heart rate will start to increase. And so these are kind of the major symptoms that you would start to experience during this time. What mistakes in training lead to this? We talked about, the obvious one is lack of recovery. And that can be lack of rest days, where we're not programming enough rest into our workouts. Another lack of recovery could be like sleep. We know the body recovers during sleep. And so if we're not sleeping, not getting like that 7 to 8 hours every night, we're not letting our body recover. And then other mistakes besides just talking about recovery is nutrition. We know that if we're not consuming enough protein during the day, that our muscles won't be able to repair themselves well enough. So we know that amino acids are necessary for muscle protein synthesis and to repair damaged tissue. We also know if we're not consuming enough carbohydrates, then we're not going to have enough energy to actually perform our workouts. We know fluid hydration, so not drinking enough water and having enough electrolytes post-sweating, that will also decrease the rate at which your action potentials travel. And so that's another reason you see that decreased motor control. And so those are kind of the main ones I would say is just like nutrition and recovery. All right, so we're gonna try to watch this video here. I think maybe we'll see. Let me pull it up and then I'll share my screen once I get it up, if it works. It might not.
Let's talk about
overtraining. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and watch this. I'm gonna do a new share. Let me get this going. And
overtraining.
okay.
In the clinical and practical research, the definition of overtraining is quite convoluted. In fact, there is no literary consensus on the exact definition of overtraining. Neither is there for its underlying causes and symptoms, with some experts debating whether it even exists at all. But research data shows overtraining at least does exist, especially in the realm of competitive sports. Data shows anywhere between 7 to 31% of athletes experience overtraining on a yearly basis. It is important, though, to distinguish overtraining to overreaching. Unlike overtraining, overreaching is actually desired. At the beginning of a training program, you'll experience a consistent performance and training capacity improvement over time. Eventually, performance capacity stagnates and then decreases, aka you start to functionally overreach. This is desired because once you begin taking recovery measures for overreaching, which takes roughly 1 to 2 weeks to fully recover, your body not only reverses the performance drop, but you actually end up improving well beyond past previous capacities. This is known as supercompensation. When you do not rest and instead train through it, performance continues to wane. Around 4 weeks of training past degradation, a few weeks of recovery is no longer enough, and supercompensation ceases to exist. This is the point where the literature agrees on defining the phase of overtraining. Much of the literature also classifies overtraining as a syndrome. Underlying the causes and symptoms of overtraining are multifactorial in nature and is not solely just changes in training and performance. In terms of symptoms, along with impaired performance, an overtrained individual experiences combinations of sleep disturbances, mood disturbances, fatigue, heavy sweating, upper respiratory tract infections, and loss of appetite. The commonality of these symptoms can make it tricky to actually diagnose overtraining. I feel that this survey from the 2012 paper by Mayusin and colleagues provides a good starting point in detecting overtraining for yourself, since it touches on training duration, factors commonly overlooked, and more. Check it out for yourself in the link in the description. Again, causes vary as well. Mental stress can be a cause, where athletes suffer disproportionately due to their chase for perfection and competitive nature. Poor workout program, where the program far exceeds the individual's fitness level. Lack of quality sleep, which will affect all daily functions, especially physical activity. And poor nutrition, where low protein intake can hinder recovery, low carb intake fails to replenish glycogen stores, and not enough water leads to dehydration. Chronic calorie deficits are also problematic due to overall lack of nutrition and energy. As far as the training itself, research suggests that training volume is the bigger culprit than training intensity. In several studies comparing training volume to training intensity at training levels above norm, sickness and lowered immune cell counts were strongly correlated to increased volume loads. Do note that intensity can still cause overtraining as well, but the magnitude of effect of each cause on the propensity to overtrain seems to vary from person to person. Something like mental stress might contribute heavily to overtraining vulnerability in one person, while another person suffers mightily when lacking sleep. And finally, what about dealing with overtraining? The best way to deal with overtraining is to prevent it from happening at all. Regular rest is critical. In a joint consensus statement between the European College of Sports Science and the American College of Sports Medicine, they recommend at least 1 rest day per week. Personally, I think at least 2 would be more fitting, especially for beginners that require more time adapting to soreness and the change in lifestyle. Dealing with mental stress is imperative, and using self-assessment mood logs, mind-body therapies, and building a strong social support system can be extremely beneficial. If you want more details on dealing with mental stress, feel free to check out my video on the very topic. Sleep is definitely a big one. Best case scenario is to get 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep. This will be a balancing act though, since one of the symptoms of overtraining and overreaching is a dip in sleep quality. Again, got some videos on that as well if you want to check it out.
So that video continues, but that kind of covered the most of it that I wanted us to see. So let's flip back and just kind of look at this table right here. So this table shows our acute fatigue, functional overreaching, non-functional, and then OTS. So we look at performance and we see with acute fatigue, we'll see no effect. We'll see an increase in performance during this time. And then with functional overreaching, we might see a temporary drop in performance as our body's recovering from like excessive soreness, but that eventually will return to baseline. And then it'll start to increase. Non-functional overreaching, we see stagnation. We're not seeing any improvements. We may decrease. And then same thing with OTS. We see a drop without any stagnation. We're just losing our performance ability. We look over here at the different performances anaerobically. Neural, we see altered neural function, motor unit recruitment, decreased coordination. So this starts to kind of accumulate. With skeletal muscle, we see those drops in force production. Over here with metabolic, we see our energy stores have dropped. We see resting heart rate, blood pressure starts to increase, altered immune function. And then with OTS, we start getting sick. We are exposed. We can get infections more easily. And then endocrine, we see altered hormone control. So where our hormones are disrupted and not being released correctly. And then psychological, mood disturbances, emotional issues going on, and sleep disturbances. All right, so the next part is we're gonna talk about detraining. And so let's just think conceptually, like we hit this point of overtraining, we're experiencing all of this fatigue, this accumulation of these adverse side effects, these symptoms. Well, we could go into this detraining period. So yeah, what's the definition of detraining? It's actually a cessation in any of our program design variables. It does not have to be all of them together. It can just be a reduction in just one of them. So cessation of training or substantial reduction, and it could be frequency, like the number of days that you're actually training, could be volume. So your rep and set numbers, or if you're doing aerobic exercise, it could be like duration of your workouts. And then intensity, how heavy you're lifting for aerobics, like how fast you're running. Or it can be a combination of all of them. So what we see down here is 60 days of training, okay? 60 days of training, there's our timeline right there. And then we have 40 days of detraining, okay? That makes up our 100 days. We see over here increases, this is increases in performance, initial plus our performance increase. So like our initial performance level plus how much we've seen an increase during this time of 60 days. We have three things we're looking at. We're looking at this bottom gray line, cross-sectional area of muscle tissue. This is referring to the lower extremities, so like quadricep muscles. And then we see MVC force, so maximal voluntary contraction, force production, and we see EMG, so electromyography. All right, so during our 60 days, we see all of these start to improve with a substantial increase in our EMG signal, which means that our MVC force has improved as well. So these two here, the black line and the red line, are basically positively correlated and will increase together. And then cross-sectional area doesn't have anything to do with this neural part, which is the red and the black line. Next, let's talk about this loss part during the detraining period. So now we have 40 days of detraining where we have stopped our training completely. What do we see? We see this red line will drop down completely, and it is correlated with that black line, which is our MVC force production. But what do we see with the gray line? It stays relatively stable with very small decrements throughout those 40 days. So what we want to understand about detraining is we lose strength gains first. So we put on strength gains initially in the beginning of a training program. Well, the rate at which we lose strength gains, so that's just reversed. We lose them as quickly as we have gained them. So this is our reversibility principle. If we stop training, everything starts to reverse. But the rate of reversal is different depending on what factor of fitness we're looking at, as well as how the rate or the process of detraining goes. So we see here strength gains. We know strength gains are related to all of the neural changes initially. Well, all of those neural changes start to reverse. And this is one of the first things we see in athletes who take a detraining period. But loss of hypertrophic gain, so cross-sectional area of muscle fibers, this occurs at a lot slower pace. We can maintain the size of our muscle way longer than we can actually retain the strength of that muscle. And so this is kind of how our detraining period will start to look. But let's talk a little bit more about detraining right here. So effects of detraining on muscle strength and size. This first bullet point may be a little surprising. Once we start a detraining period, strength is lost most in that first week, but our percentage is only 3 to 4%. So a very small percentage of strength is lost, but it's lost pretty dramatically within the first week. So after 1 week of going through a detraining period, we see these initial drops. But then after this, we think that 3 to 4% per day starts to slow down and starts to level out. We do know that both type 1 and type 2 fibers are affected, but we will look at which fibers are affected more in just a minute. We also will look at the difference between if we drop frequency versus if we drop intensity. So frequency, I want you to think about in your workouts, you are maintaining the weight that you're using in your workouts. So you're lifting the same weight or you're running the same pace, or your intensity level is still the same. But instead of training, we'll say like 4 days a week, you're now only training 3 days a week. Okay. Well, during that, we can actually maintain our strength or maintain our performance for 12 weeks, okay? So this is just with reduced training frequency. If we just drop that frequency just a little bit, we can still see, or we can still maintain kind of everywhere we were. If we reduce training intensity, we're gonna see a lot greater decrements start to occur. And so with these greater decrements, we would see, and we won't be able to maintain as well. And then the decrements will start occurring faster. What's interesting though, is compared to endurance training, rate of detraining after resistance training is a lot slower. So meaning that if I'm an aerobic athlete and I get injured and I have to take off, within 1 to 2 weeks of going through a detraining period from aerobic exercise, your VO2 starts to decrease within that 1 to 2 weeks. So you'll see drops in VO2 within 1 to 2 weeks of taking a detraining period. Whereas with strength training, we can double that time frame. We can see like 2 to 4 weeks of being able to maintain your strength levels before you start to see drops. So endurance training, the rate of detraining is a lot faster. And then with muscle mass, so this just talks about strength really. With muscle mass, we'll see a lot slower decrements. We can maintain size of muscle tissue for several months, even though the strength of that muscle tissue has been reduced significantly. Okay, so that's detraining. Our next topic, kind of our last topic, is retraining. And so with this, few things we want to look at is this first statement here. When we stop training or go through a detraining period with a cessation of any of our variables, strength gains drop slowly and they don't return all the way to baseline. And so when we think of baseline, I want you to think of where you were before you even started training at all. So this baseline is not at the end of like your injury period or like at the end of your training period. When we're referring to baseline, we're referring to our starting point with training. The amount of strength that we retain is rarely lower than pre-training values. And when we say pre-training values, we're referring to, again, the very start of your training career. So very start of your training age is the pre-training values or the baseline. So we never reverse all the way. We always retain something. How? This is where muscle memory comes into play. So muscle memory does have this validation. When we think of muscle memory, we think of probably riding a bike. So if we haven't ridden a bike in several years, we can easily get on the bike and continue to know exactly what we're doing. Resistance training is similar in the fact that when we perform dynamic movements, our muscles are exposed to this, especially the muscle nuclei and the nervous system programs, or we call them motor neuron programs. And so with this memory, we are able to perform the same dynamic movements, even if we aren't able to perform or use the same weight that we had been previously. But due to this neuromuscular programming and something called myonuclei within our myocytes, we are able to retain some sort of programming that has to do with how heavy we are able to lift. And so let's talk about myonuclei. Well, first, we know myocytes are just fancy name for a muscle cell or a muscle fiber. Myonuclei, the nucleus within that muscle fiber, that myocyte. So there is some sort of programming that takes place in the myonuclei when we're exposed to resistance training. The myonuclei, they multiply and they replicate each other. And so with this multiplication and replication of each other, within or across your muscle tissue, that helps us to retain kind of the same programming of the amount of weight we were able to use, the dynamic movement we performed, the patterns, whatever it was. And so when we come back to retraining after a detraining period, it's a lot easier. So let's look here at what we see on this first graph in the left. Percent maximal strength leg extension. And so this is starting at 100% of wherever your maximal leg extension strength is, which we know is our quadriceps muscles. So we have all of our maximal strength. And then we go through, and this was crazy. I looked at it, 30 weeks of detraining. So think of 30 weeks of not doing any quadricep work. So our strength gains dropped by 31% during this time frame. 31% drop. But the good news is during this retraining period that you see, it was only a 6-week retraining program. So 6 weeks of retraining after 30 weeks of taking off. And we see that our strength is almost back to where we started once we ended that training period. Over here, we look at muscle fiber cross-sectional area. We see our trained individuals. So these numbers here, this is just the units in which the muscle fiber cross-sectional area is measured. We see our fibers. And then we see a detraining period. During this detraining period, we actually see the size of type 2 fibers decrease to a greater extent than our type 1 fibers do. So type 1 fibers decrease to the greatest extent. But if you look at the retraining after like the 6 weeks, we're even higher than what we were when we started. So we don't return all the way to baseline with our fibers. We don't see huge decrements and loss of size. And we're able to easily reverse those losses when we start training again. So we have one more video to watch that will kind of talk about this retraining and how this retraining works here. So let me get that slide back up really quickly. I just canceled it out. All right, so
Your motive.
Let me share this.
Motivated, you work out, you work hard, and 6 months later, you're twice as strong as before and looking better than ever. And then, bam, you get hit with an injury or get busy with work or even just lose motivation and you stop working out for 3 months. You lose all the results you worked so hard for, but now you want to get back into it. Round two, you're motivated, you work out, you work hard, and this time, only 2 months instead of the 6 months that it took the first time, you're back to where you were before. What's going on here is a concept that some of you might be familiar with, known as muscle memory. The theory is that if you train and then you take a break, coming back to where you left off is much easier than getting there in the first place. The term muscle memory might be a bit misleading since no actual memory exists within your muscle. But two things are happening here, one of which is happening within your central nervous system. Whenever a motor skill is learned, such as a squat, the information is stored within the brain region known as the cerebellum. The more you practice the skill, the more efficient you become. Even after taking a long break from squatting, once you go back, your neuromuscular system is already programmed to complete the movement efficiently. This is also why we can still ride a bike, swim, and also bust out those awesome dance moves, even after not doing them for a long time. Another interesting occurrence happens within your muscle cells. The first time you begin training, the muscles adapt and become stronger and bigger. One way it facilitates this is by increasing the amount of muscle nuclei, aka myonuclei, within the muscle cells. It was long believed that when you stop training, the muscle begins to atrophy and programmed cell death called apoptosis takes place and the myonuclei are removed. But current research actually shows that the overwhelming majority of myonuclei still exist within the muscle cells even after long periods of not training. And since they are still there, the muscle cells can skip the process of creating new myonuclei, allowing strength gains and hypertrophy to occur at a much faster rate. That's why you only need 2 months, hypothetically, instead of the initial 6 months to get back to where you were before. And that's what muscle memory is all about. Have more fitness and health.
I think that video does a great job explaining the role of myonuclei and how we can return to our pre-training caliber even after a detraining period. But that was it for our adaptations to training lecture. So I'll send out an email with whatever else you have to do, which is work on your assignment, which has questions from this lecture that I just talked about overtraining and retraining, detraining, all of that. So basically everything I just talked about today is one of your questions on your assignment. And then you also have a quiz to take before we return back to class. So that is it for this lecture, and I will keep you all updated with whatever else you have to do.